much for this kind introduction. And thank you, Mary-Lou, for this very warm presentation based on scientific facts. Mary-Lou always asks to you to make an applause for others. So I think let's make again an applause for Mary-Lou, who's got the most scientifically proven warm heart in the world. Thank you for this presentation. That's been very, very important. But and now I will start with my presentation. Indra said that I've already did some music, but when I took a look at the piano and I listened to Professor Brian Clark, who talked about the small claims obligatory mediation in UK done by the telephone, I got a little bit inspired. So let me start with a little piece of music, okay? You might join if you want. It's just, I just call to say I love you. I just call to say how much I care. I just call to say I love you. And I mean it from the bottom of my heart. And that's the song. That's the song also related with the heart, so also the Mary-Lou presentation, and the telephone, of course. So I could rephrase the question that I had, being inspired by the piano and by Professor Clark, that the question is whether we can use efficiently the telephone and other apps, because I've heard a lot about apps during this conference, to be effective and to be empathic, to build the trust during the mediation, how it works. And I did a little research on that. The first thing is the warm intro, of course. Then I will tell you a few things about the definition issues from the legal perspective, because I try to combine those both educational fields, law and psychology, together. And then I will share you some insights from the little research that I made, which, of course, should be probably done on the broader group of people altogether. One more thing, it's, of course, a great pleasure here to be in Vilnius at this conference. This is actually I can say this now, I think, Mary-Lou and Frank, because this is the third conference, INIDR conference, that we are having. The first one was in Poznan indeed. It was a smaller conference, so I really am glad that it's growing up. And then we had a conference in Bologna before the tournament, and I think it's becoming the tradition already, and we'll have every time before the tournament, we'll have a conference. I've got also one memory from Vilnius. When I was in high school, we had a trip with other colleagues. And that's not a good memory, unfortunately, because as you can imagine, high school students have got some different ideas how to spend time in the evenings. And unfortunately, I was in the room when people had not a very good idea to spend this evening. And then I was among four other students. It was quite a noble high school, so it was good to be there. And I was accused of doing those things. I really don't remember I did that. So I think I didn't, but I was accused of. And I felt that no one listened to me, really, the director of the school, etc. I tried to explain, but no one was listening. So maybe that was the first step towards the mediation in my life, that I thought you can talk with people in a different way to find the solution and to solve the case. But then the Vilnius is today, and hopefully I will have other memories from that beautiful city. So that's, yeah, another thing from the warm meeting. Then let's go to the merits. And first question, of course, to all of us is, what are we talking about when we think about online mediation, online dispute resolution methods, e-mediation, and other different types of trying to communicate with each other? And there are a lot of terms on that. You know most of them, and you've got some icons that can symbolize how we can do that, and how people in mediation, also in my almost 20-year mediation practice, how people try to communicate. Somehow they do it partially in the part of mediation, sometimes they do it more often. So when we try to name them, right, we've got two types of understanding of the online mediation. That's what literature about this issue says. And we can understand it as the dispute that arose in the distance environment means, which is the online mediation, or the dispute that arose in the online environment. Okay, and then we are using distance methods or online methods or other methods. And we've got the second type, the second understanding, the procedure of solving the dispute takes place in online environment. And when we think about not only online mediation, but generally the mediation that takes place in the distance, when the parties are in the distance, we can try to implement this definition and say that it might be the dispute that arose in the distance environment, and distance means of communication using, and the procedure of solving the disputes takes place in this distance environment. And of course, I want to focus on the second meaning, okay? So on the methods that we use to solve the problem and to help people to get together. And what I understand by the distance mediation, I was wondering how we can structure somehow this, those notions that we use very often, online, e-mediation, etc. And I found the directive of the European Parliament, which you might be surprised, but might be inspiring for some people. And I found the Article 2, which defines the distance contract. Of course, it concerns something totally different, not the mediation, but generally the protection of the consumers. And it says that the distance contract is blah, 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 and then makes exclusive use of one of more means of distance communication up to and including the moment of which the contract is concluded. And in the Polish implementation, in the Polish legal act that we have, it even says that without the simultaneous physical presence of the parties, okay? So I took this definition and thought, that's very handy. Let's try to define the distance mediation in the very similar and same way. So the definition proposal is that the distance mediation would be a mediation ongoing, at least partially, without the simultaneous physical presence of the party or parties and the mediator, with the exclusive use of one or more means of distance communication. That's what comes from that. And I focus on that understanding, that very understanding when we think about the mediation, the distance mediation and the research that I did, which, as you can see, this definition includes all of the means that we use to communicate during the mediation, even all of the means that we don't know yet, that might come in the future, but when we are in a kind of distance between each other. And of course, it changes a lot from the perspective of the psychology of the conflict, the theory of the conflict, and how people build the trust and other issues. So what we focused on is that, first, of course, I'm focusing only on some parts of this research because I know that the time is limited and it's quite late. So the question to the mediators was whether they were using the telephone to say, I love you, during the joint session, or did they use the video online more often? And when you can see, I've also divided it to caucuses and joint session, but in Poland, that's really phenomenal, because I've heard that in the United States, most mediators use caucuses method, and very often the parties don't meet at all. In Poland, it's totally opposite. I would say the joint session is a basic method to meet the people, and then we separate them if we see that it's useful. So we've got a totally, culturally maybe, different perspective on that. So in the joint session, as you can see, much more mediators use video online session to meet the parties, but they don't use the telephone. So the teleconferences are not that popular among at least the people that have been researched. And then what mediators said about the pros and cons of the distance mediation methods. And I took one quotation from that research, which says, well, surprised me a little bit, because we usually say the distance communication is less effective. People are not that comfortable with the distance communication, but I will tell you in a second what was released. So the pros and the profits that people shown was, of course, the profits time related. So we can save the time, we can save the costs, the distance, okay, so logistics of the mediation, that's quite obvious, but the research shows that it matters for the mediators. And for the communication skills, that was very interesting. For an introvert, it is more comfortable as I am behind the glass wall for me. And also for the parties, right? If somebody is shy, sometimes this glass wall gives a kind of zone of comfort, at least for the very beginning of the session, which might help. And that was surprising for me in that. And also this professional, that distance mediation might be treated as a professional tool. So I'm showing to the parties that I can be flexible in methods. I can meet you personally, but I can also meet with you online. I've got some tools, I've got good internet connection, blah, blah, blah. So this all creates the image of me as a professional mediator. That's what mediators say. But what are the obstacles or the cons, the risks of the distance mediation? And I've grouped it to the 3 points. These are procedural. So in different legal systems, sometimes you can sign the agreement being totally online or on the distance and use some technology to do that and to make it legally binding, because this is sometimes very important. For example, in Poland. But in Poland, you have to sign it, meaning you have to use the pen and to sign the documents. There is an electronic form, but you have to have some certificates, you have to pay for them, so it's not that easy in Poland. Then the technical issues, of course, this is the risk. Very often, you've probably all have got this experience that the communication is difficult. We have also had this experience in IN ADR competitions. During the online competitions, very often something was happening with someone's internet connection, etc., etc. And then the communication. People say that the communication decreases. And when we take a look at comparison, because to a few fields, when we compare non-distance and the distance mediation, okay, so the people generally say, the majority of people, that confidentiality risk or breaching the confidentiality of the mediation, that the risk increases in the distant mediation, right? So that we keep the confidentiality, it means that it's easier to keep the confidentiality in the non-distance mediation, so traditional or stationary mediation, we could say. There are more risks on that in the distance mediation. Then working with emotions, and still here we've got also that distance mediation does not help to work with emotions. So when we go back to the Mary-Lou's presentation, and the emotions are important, sometimes touching emotions, building also the trust, as you can see, it's still the same. Mediators see and observe that when we meet in person, it helps us to build the trust, it helps us to work with emotions of the parties. But what's interesting, and maybe that's the hint when we can use partially the distance and non-distance mediation, is then the mediators don't see the difference when we take a look at the working on merits. So anything that should be the matter of the dispute, not emotions, and working on the settlement content and the agreement. They see both methods are quite the same, and they are not afraid to use them. And at the end, the general preference that I've asked the parties is, I prefer leading or taking part in distance mediation than in stationary mediation, so non-distance mediation. And as you can see, for most people, it doesn't really matter nowadays. So we are in the post-COVID time, and we all got used to that. It was like years ago when I talked to the parties and say, okay, we can meet online, we can use the telephone to communicate somehow in mediation. And people were very surprised. Nowadays, I don't see it. I don't see also that the lawyers are surprised in this kind of method. Very often they propose it in Poland by themselves that, okay, we can meet, but let's do it online because it will be faster, it will be easier, etc., etc. So these are the small research that support probably the way that we think about it and some intuitions that we have had, but hopefully it will give you some hints and also some knowledge that you will be able to broaden the research and to use it in your practice, and I'm giving the floor to the next speaker. Thank you very much.